Hi, I'm Jim Holmberg with the Filson Historical Society. I'm standing here with Ed Hamilton's wonderful sculpture of York of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Of course, you that are familiar with the expedition's history know that York was the enslaved African American of William Clark, who accompanied him on the expedition. Born a slave into the Clark family, York's father, Old York, actually was part of the forward group along with Jonathan Clark that built Mulberry Hill and had it ready for the Clark family when they arrived in Louisville in 1785, or outside Louisville. York was approximately the same age as William Clark, and as custom was then, the white children of the family would often be assigned an enslaved member of the family of about the same age. So William Clark and York grew up together. York obviously was named after his father, and as his father got older, he became Old York, and York was, of course, just York. But York accompanied William as a playmate in his army days in the 1790s. He probably was with William off and on as his servant and running errands between Louisville and even up into Ohio for them. We have some evidence that that is what he was doing. And he was raised on the frontier just like William Clark was. And so when it came time to put together that nucleus of the Corps of Discovery here at the Falls of the Ohio in 1803, William Clark had no hesitation whatsoever about including York. He would make camp life easier, as he had on numerous other trips. He had traveled extensively with Clark, not only in the Army, but on civilian trips around the country, east of the Mississippi. He could hunt, he could fish, he could swim, he knew the land, he could handle boats, he could handle horses. So he was a talented guy, he was a frontiersman himself, and Clark was saying, like, come on, York, you're going with me. Now, he also was one of the very few married men, which did not matter because as an enslaved person, Clark, as his owner, said, come on, York, you're going with me. And York really had no option but to do that. But he had been separated from his family any number of times already, and they were all in the same boat, so to speak, of going off alone with others, on this expedition and leaving family behind. Well, on the expedition, of course, as we know, he fulfilled his role. He was one of the most valuable members of the expedition for all those talents that I've already mentioned, and also because of his black skin. One of the French-Canadian traders that they encountered up in the Mandan Hidatsa villages described him as being as black as a bear. The Native Americans, some of the tribes like the Arikara, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, later on the Shoshone and the Nez Perce, whom had never seen anybody with black skin before, at first thought Lewis and Clark were trying to play a trick on them. The Salish, in fact, said they thought they had taken ashes and covered them as a sign of mourning or as being a great warrior. And so they were amazed when they found out that this was somebody who actually had black skin. And in their culture, that made him very spiritually powerful, most of the tribes they encountered. And so he was used by Lewis and Clark to actually help move the expedition forward. They're saying, well, if you think he's so special and spiritually powerful, he works for us. And we work for the Great White Father back in Washington. So that's why you should do whatever we tell you to. And of course, the native peoples would take all the gifts that Lewis and Clark would give them, and as soon as they were around the next bend of the river or over the next hill, they'd do whatever they wanted, because the force of the United States was in no position until some years later to actually try to enforce their will on the people. When the expedition comes back in 1806, what's going to happen with York? York was never an official member of the expedition. He did not get any of the benefits. He didn't get pay, he didn't get a land grant. Any reward he was going to get was going to come from his master, William Clark. And for William Clark, things were just going to go back to the way they were. And for the next couple of years, we don't know exactly, other than York running errands, being in Louisville, probably going at least to Washington with Clark in 1806-07, coming back, things like that. But in June of 1808, William Clark moves to St. Louis. And he's taking his new wife, Julia Hancock, with him. He's taking some of his other enslaved African Americans and York. And there's a problem, because York's wife, given that terrible institution of slavery, York's wife was owned by somebody else. And we don't know if Clark tried to acquire her so she could go as well, but we think they also had children. And so Clark tells York to simply forget about his wife. Now, this was something that, for York to insist on sticking to his guns, so to speak, of being able to remain in Louisville near his wife, shows, I think, the level of love and dedication he had for her, to give up what was then about the highest position in the pecking order of enslaved people that he could have, with someone who was a national hero, going off to St. Louis in a high government job as the chief Indian agent and brigadier general of the militia. He was a national hero, and this should have been pretty good for York. But within a couple of months of being in St. Louis, he's homesick, he's wife sick, he wants to come back to Louisville, and he starts talking to Clark and agitating with Clark to let him return to Louisville. And William Clark is like, no, you're with me, just get over that wife of yours. Again, not an unusual slaveholder mentality to treat his enslaved people as property and to just simply do as he wishes. Also, I think you have to remember the personal connection. These were two men that had grown up together. They'd essentially been side by side through their lives, and especially on that expedition, that American Odyssey, as Stephen Ambrose called it, to the Pacific and back. And here was York choosing his wife over his longtime master and companion, William Clark. Never friends, as it's sometimes depicted, but owner and property, master and slave. And York is refusing to do this. And so he starts agitating for Clark to hire him out to someone in Louisville. Clark says no. To sell him to someone in Louisville. Clark says no. And finally, York says, I think I deserve my freedom. And Clark doesn't think so. And in these incredible letters that are in the Filson's collection, and that William is writing Jonathan about everything going on, he addresses York in this situation in numerous letters, which is absolute research gold, because we can now pretty well track York's life and movements post-expedition, which we had very, very little of before. And so Clark says no, but he says, I think York now has such a notion of freedom, about freedom, that I don't think he'd be of much service to me again. And he does allow York to go back to Louisville for a visit, but in that same letter, when he writes Jonathan and says, okay, I'm letting him go back for a visit, but he says if York refuses to perform his duty as a slave, I wish him sent to New Orleans and sold. Which, of course, to us today kind of blows our minds that he would even threaten something like that. But again, you must remember the time that they're in. These are people of their time. You had certain attitudes. And in the long run, it was just a threat, because he never actually sold York. He did eventually free him, probably somewhere around 1818, maybe 1819. But so more than 10 years after the expedition. York does eventually, after a stay in Louisville, he stays longer than he's supposed to, comes back, or goes back to St. Louis, and is up and down. Clark complains about him in his letters to Jonathan, saying that he's a gad fellow to work. I've gotten him out of jail. We don't know if Clark put him in jail as a punishment. On one occasion, he says that he whips him. He says, I gave him a severe trouncing, but now he's behaving himself better. So you can see that this has become a very fractious relationship. A real chasm has opened up between these two almost lifelong individuals, and it's because of slavery and the position of one owning the other and being able to dictate and control his life. Finally, in 1809, the summer of 1809, William Clark washes his hands of York. He sends him off in a boat to Wheeling, he says, and then when he comes back down the Ohio and gets to Louisville, he asks Jonathan to do whatever he wants with him, hire him out to a severe master, maybe that'll teach him a lesson, sell him if he thinks he should, but he does end up with severe masters. He does end up hired out in Louisville, and to our knowledge, never actually returns to Clark in St. Louis. In fact, by 1815, he's not even sure what's going on with York, and in November of 1815, he's found out what the situation is, and he and his nephew, John Height Clark, Jonathan's oldest son, form a freight hauling business in Louisville. And in that contract, which is in the Filson's collection, York is named as the wagon driver. So almost 10 years after the return of the expedition, we know for a fact that York was still a slave, because he's listed as York, slave of General William Clark. So it's a sad ending. We think his wife, he's gotten a report several years before that his wife's owner was going to move down to Natchez. I think probably it was actually Nashville, because when York is freed, according to Clark, as he tells Washington Irving in 1832 in an interview, he freed York, doesn't say when, he says he freed York, set him up in a freight hauling business between Nashville and Richmond, we believe Richmond, Kentucky, and there was a road between those two, and that he was a poor businessman, one of his horses died, he didn't get up early enough in the morning. You know, just a lot of slave owner rationalization as to, yeah, see, I told you it wasn't going to be so good. He says that he quotes York as saying he damned the day he ever got his freedom. Again, perhaps slave owner rationalization. Of course, frustration on York's part. He hires himself out. We don't know if York ever really got to be close to his wife, if she was in the Nashville area. But then Clark reports that York died of cholera in Tennessee, trying to return to him in St. Louis to probably see if he could work for him and have some kind of aid from his former master. That's the sad ending of the story. That almost certainly is the true ending of the story of York's life. It's a sad ending to end up in an unmarked pauper's grave, having died of cholera. The happy ending is there's a tale that he returned to the Rocky Mountains and was a respected chief among the Crow Indians and a great warrior. That probably is not true, almost I think certainly not true. I think it's that unmarked grave somewhere in Tennessee. But for what York accomplished in his life as an enslaved person, it's a tale of triumph and tragedy, and for what he stood up for, what he believed he had earned and deserved in his life. So not only as one of those members of the famed Corps of Discovery and helping make it a success, but for what he personally believed in and held to as what he deserved in life. During the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, here in the Louisville area, Louisville metropolitan area, Kentuckiana as it's known, folks here in Louisville and across the river, our friends in Jeffersonville, Clarksville, and New Albany, the Tri-Cities there, we all came together and did a lot, not only in our respective states, but especially here in the metropolitan Louisville area. We formed together, we formed the Falls of the Ohio Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Committee. And that committee did a number of things, many things during the Bicentennial. And I was involved, I was on the board, and one of the things that we wanted to look at were legacy projects. And we did this with the Kentucky Bicentennial Lewis and Clark Commission also. But as a legacy project, I was already deeply involved with York. He was one of my special areas, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a heroic-sized bronze of York by himself? He'd been actually included in some others, or was going to be, but I thought, you know, we ought to have just one. And I know the perfect person to do it, and that was somebody right here in Louisville, nationally known sculptor Ed Hamilton. So I visited with Ed one day. I brought him a copy of Robert Betts's really good book, Biography of York, In Search of York, the slave who went to the Pacific with Lewis and Clark. I had done the epilogue for the new edition of that, which updated York's post-expedition life. And so with all that still churning in my mind, I thought, again, you know, we ought to do a statue dedicated to York for what his accomplishments were and the triumph and the tragedy of his life. And so I visited with Ed, pitched it to him. He was intrigued. He read the book, and he said, well, if you can get funding, I'm on board. And so I then approached the Board of Aldermen at that time, before Louisville and Jefferson County merged as Metro Louisville. I appeared before the Board of Aldermen to pitch the project. I met with Dave Armstrong, who was the mayor of Louisville at the time, and pitched the project. And they all agreed that this was something that Louisville should do to honor this enslaved African American and for what he accomplished in American history and in his life, and as far as exploration was concerned. And so they provided the funding. We put together a committee. Ed was on it, I was on it, several other people involved with government and other nonprofits were on it, and we scouted sites, and we came up with the Belvedere as the best site for this, overlooking the Ohio River. Here is York looking off to the northwest, where he would be going west in the northwest on the expedition, and really across the river towards freedom, something he would not experience until more than 10 years after the expedition. But Ed worked on it. I'd visit with Ed in his studio. We'd go back and forth about, you know, maybe what was working, what wasn't. I know Frank X. Walker, the poet laureate of Kentucky at one time, himself African American as Ed is, who wrote wonderful poetry about York and the voice of York for the expedition. He'd go and visit Ed and look at the statue. And so with all this coming together on the national signature event on the 200th anniversary, October 14th, 2003, of Meriwether Lewis reaching Louisville and actually forming that famous partnership physically of Lewis and Clark, Ed's wonderful York statue was unveiled. And it was an entirely miserable day. The weather had been gorgeous, and that day it set in, it poured rain, it was windy, it was cold, and of course the day after that was sunny and beautiful again, but we weren't going to miss that, everything that was lined up. And so since then, and it's hard to believe, the 21 years almost since then, York has been here on the Belvedere, looking out towards the west and freedom as well, and is one of the great, I think, contributions that we could make in memory of York and to honor him for what he accomplished. not only on the expedition, but in post-expedition life, standing up to his master in that he believed he had earned his freedom, and really sacrificing his position on that hierarchy of slavery. He was right up at the top as William Clark's manservant, essentially, to speak up for his freedom and wanting to remain in Louisville with his wife instead of being separated from her when Clark moved to St. Louis. So it's both the triumph and the tragedy of York's life that we're honoring in this wonderful bronze that Ed Hamilton sculpted.